So the kind of American part of my book tour is pretty much over. I'm actually recording this from Canada, and I've then I'm going to Australia and the UK and Ireland, and I don't have many more book events in the United States. I've been traveling around the US for like more than 3 months now, and one of the really interesting things about doing that is I get a kind of a sense of the conversation about Israel-Palestine at maybe at a more grassroots level than I would otherwise, and it's especially interesting because I can compare what I see now to what I saw when I wrote this book called The Crisis of Zionism 13 years ago, back in 2012, just to see how things look different when I go out and speak to lots of different folks than they did back then. And reflecting on it, two things really struck me, two differences have really struck me. The first is a kind of collapse of what you could call the kind of liberal pro-Israel position. When in 2012, when my book came out, and that was it was kind of less radical book. I mean, I was still supported a two-state solution of a Jewish state next to a Palestinian state back then, but the book was still pretty harshly attacked by a lot of people, by a bunch of people, journalists, commentators who were kind of liberals in good standing, and they thought I was being too harshly critical of Israel. And their voices were really, those were the toughest critics, those were the most important criticisms of the book. And they were tough for me because these were people who were arguing from within a kind of similar ideological or kind of moral position that I was, about liberal democracy, about equality, but they were still very quite staunch defenders of Israel. And I think that today, what I notice, what the book kind of response to the book has really made clear to me is that those voices are much, much weaker than they are now. It's partly generational, I think, because that position was stronger amongst older people, and more than a decade has passed now. Um, I think it's partly because the whole center of gravity in kind of liberal/progressive kind of circles has moved left. I mean, a lot, it was that, 12 years, 13 years ago was also a time where you would have found more people who were considered liberals in good standing in the sense that like they were influential commentators, who had the ear of prominent people in the Democratic Party who would have been more hawkish in foreign policy, right? Who were still defending the intervention in Afghanistan, if not Iraq, and supporting military intervention in Syria or Libya. That position also, I think, is largely gone by the wayside. Those people, there was also, I think, more legitimacy to a kind of more neoliberal economic position policy in the Democratic Party. So these activist movements, starting with Occupy in 2011 and Black Lives Matter and Me Too and others, I think have pushed the center of gravity in general in kind of mainstream progressive and liberal debate. And so I think you see that on Israel and Palestine as well. It's not that there are of course still a lot of politicians who kind of are in good standing in the Democratic Party and are very pro-Israel, Richie Torres or John Fetterman and all these people. But if you look at kind of in public commentary among journalists, writers, people in the public culture, I think you find that position is much, much weaker and much less prominent. Some people who used to defend Israel, who are liberals, I notice just really don't write much about the subject, or some of them write about anti-Semitism as a problem, left-wing problem, but you notice they don't really write actually much defending what Israel's actually doing. And so what I've noticed is that it's meant that there's been a lot of really harsh criticism in my book, but most of it is really now coming from people who are kind of firmly anchored on the ideological right. They're not people who speak within a kind of liberal, let alone progressive idiom. And so even though I don't, the criticisms are still very harsh, I don't feel like they're coming from people who are kind of speaking within the same kind of ideological perspective that I am. It feels just much, much more polarized. And I think that you see this in the Jewish community in particular, in which the energy in pro-Israel circles in the United States is not among self-described liberals. It's among people who actually are anti-liberal and are very comfortable with the Trumpian Republican Party in general. One consequence for me of this has been that it's actually, I feel like I'm less likely to speak in ideologically mixed spaces, or in some ways like there's kind of less of a centrist group of people for me to speak to because there's such great polarization now that I'm in more right-leaning spaces. I'm not going to be invited to speak, and so I don't have the experience which I used to have more of speaking to groups of people where people really had more significant disagreements with me, and I really miss that. It's really, in some ways, the saddest thing for me about this whole experience is that while it's nice to speak to people you agree with, I find that it's I'm less and less likely to be invited to speak to the kind of audiences where people would disagree with me. But I think that's partly because my position has become more radical, but also because I think of this broader polarization in general, within the Jewish community and in America more generally. Um, the second thing that I've noticed is that I feel like 13 years ago, the Palestinian solidarity world and the kind of Jewish kind of anti-occupation world, the kind of world of J Street, wanting and opposing settlements, that kind of thing, were very, very distinct. And I felt like when I used to speak to kind of liberal uh, groups, Jewish groups, there were very few Palestinians around very frequently. And I think that over the last 13 years, what I feel like is that those two worlds have kind of come to coincide more, which is to say, I feel like there's a more integrated Jewish and Palestinian and other kind of set community of people, and than there was back then, or at least that I had access to back then. And I think it's partly because all of these years of the Netanyahu government and Israel's destruction of the two-state solution and Israel moving further and further right has led people who were genuinely opposed to occupation and to the settlements, I think, to become many of them more open, especially younger people, to become more open to the deeper, more fundamental criticisms of the idea of a Jewish state and of political Zionism. And I think as that's happened, what I've noticed is that in this book tour, I'm much more likely to meet Jews and Palestinians and other folks who, across these different lines of ethnicity and religion and community or whatever, have built really strong ties to one another. I feel like over the last decade, the activist work that's been done has built stronger bonds of trust between genuinely progressive Jews and Palestinians and Arab Americans and Muslim Americans and other folks than existed before. And I mean, I think you saw that in the encampments with young people, where you had these genuinely very, very diverse groups of people who were coming together to protest. And it's really quite impressive and powerful to see the level of connection and trust and affection, and admiration that I've seen again and again in Michigan, in California, in Philadelphia, in Wisconsin, across between Jews and Palestinians, especially given that we are in a moment and where on the ground, the destruction of Palestinian life has been so brutal, and this kind of radicalization is so great. And it really does give me a sense of hope. I mean, I've the events that I do these days for the book are also much, much better attended than they were in 2012. I'd like to think that it's because I'm a much better book writer, but I think it really has to do with a greater centrality of this issue and a way in which many people have really started to have come to see this issue as central to what it means to be progressive. And when I look out at these crowds, these very diverse crowds, I feel like it seems to me like it's so obvious these people are the descendants of the people who were in the anti-apartheid movement and the anti-Vietnam War movement, and even beyond that, the people who were in the movements again for abolition of slavery and for women's suffrage in the United States. That this movement has echoes of those things, and that at its best, it embodies, in some ways, it manifests the principles that it would like to see in Israel-Palestine, which is principles of genuine equality under the law, respect for the dignity of all people, and a political community, a kind of what King called like a beloved community of people who, regardless of their different backgrounds and ancestries, actually share a common vision of the way human beings should be treated. And I'm really struck by the degree of passion and energy, even despite the terrible repression of this moment, the horror in Gaza, which gets worse and worse and worse, the fact that there are crises on so many different fronts. It's just so obvious to me that this movement, which was building before October 7th and has grown over the last year and a half a lot in opposition to the destruction of Gaza, that the movement is really not dead, that it is very, very powerful. even though that its power may be often obscured for people in Washington, or in some in the media, and that's part of the reason I think that Biden and Harris made these disastrous political decisions. They didn't understand how many people across different racial and ethnic and religious groups really cared about this subject. And my experience going is to see not only those people care, but that they're willing to work very, very hard to try to change U.S. policy. And that if there were a politician with the courage and the political skill, let's say in the 2028 presidential campaign, to put this issue front and center, to speak in the way that Zohran Mamdani is speaking in the mayoral race, and say, connect a genuine this position. I should say Brad Lander. There are others who also have a progressive record on this in the New York mayoral race, which is great that there's more than one. Ideally, we'd have more than one in a presidential race. People are willing to unapologetically connect this to a larger progressive agenda about equality and about human decency, and liberal democracy. This movement that is there would really ignite and be a very powerful force in American politics, and really have the possibility of changing the Democratic Party and changing American policy towards Israel. And so that's really what has been a tremendous source of hope for me, even in these incredibly awful and dark days. I just see how much talent and passion and energy there is across the United States. And I really do believe that one day that power of that movement will be made manifest for people as a whole across America.